Mother gives birth to 10 babies, and doctors realize one of them isn't a baby. Biggest shock. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think is going to happen, and let's see if you get it right. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. The labor ward was filled with an air of excitement and anticipation. The entire hospital had been abuzz ever since it was confirmed that Jane Thompson, a first-time mother, was expecting 10 babies. Such a rare occurrence drew the attention of doctors from all over the region, eager to witness this medical marvel. Jane had been carefully monitored throughout her pregnancy, and her health had remained surprisingly stable despite the immense strain on her body. As the day of the delivery finally arrived, Jane's heart raced with a mix of joy and anxiety. She had dreamed of being a mother for as long as she could remember, but the thought of caring for 10 infants at once overwhelmed her. Still, her determination was stronger than any fear she felt. The delivery room was prepared meticulously, with an entire team of specialists ready for the challenge. The doctors performed the C-section carefully, working swiftly to bring each child into the world. One by one, the babies were born, their cries filling the room and bringing smiles to the faces of the medical team. Each infant was quickly examined, and to everyone's relief, they were all healthy. Jane could hear the nurses announcing the genders, 5 boys and 5 girls. It was a perfect balance, a picture of harmony. As the last baby was delivered, the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. The head doctor, Dr. Mason, furrowed his brow as he examined the final newborn. He noticed something unusual and signaled for the team to move cautiously. There was silence as Dr. Mason carefully lifted the baby, but the look on his face suggested something was terribly wrong. The baby was not like the others. It wasn't crying, and its skin had an odd, pale texture. The entire room fell into an eerie quiet, with the only sound being the soft hum of the medical equipment. Jane, still recovering from the delivery, noticed the change in energy and tried to ask what was happening. Her voice, weak and hoarse, barely reached the doctor's ears. Dr. Mason hesitated before turning to the team, signaling them to move the 10th baby into a separate observation area. The medical staff exchanged puzzled glances as they quietly obeyed the command, their minds racing with questions they dared not ask aloud. Jane was exhausted but alarmed. She had expected all her babies to be healthy, just like the previous 9. What was different about this one? As the nurses wheeled the strange newborn away, Dr. Mason approached her bedside, his face grave. "Mrs. Thompson," he began cautiously, "there's something we need to discuss. Your 10th baby, it's not exactly what we expected. We need to run some tests." His words sent a chill through Jane. What could he possibly mean? She searched his face for answers, but all she found was uncertainty. The biggest shock of her life was about to unfold, and nothing could have prepared her for the truth that would soon be revealed. As Jane lay in her hospital bed, her mind raced. The words from Dr. Mason echoed in her ears. "It's not exactly what we expected." What could that mean? Her heart pounded with fear and confusion, and despite her exhaustion from delivering 10 babies, she couldn't rest. The nurses had taken 9 of her children to the nursery, each one perfectly healthy and vibrant, but the 10th, there was something different about the 10th. Jane's motherly instincts were screaming at her that something was wrong, but no one would tell her what. Her husband, Mark, sat by her side, gripping her hand, trying to offer comfort, though the worry in his eyes betrayed his calm demeanor. Meanwhile, in the observation room, the medical team was gathered around the 10th infant, speaking in hushed tones. Dr. Mason, known for his calm and collected nature, found himself deeply troubled. The baby, or at least what appeared to be a baby, wasn't exhibiting the usual signs of life. It wasn't moving or breathing in the conventional sense, yet there were faint signs of something resembling life. The skin, pale and almost translucent, had an odd texture, and the child's eyes remained shut. "This is unlike anything I've ever seen," one of the pediatricians murmured, staring in disbelief. They had run the standard tests, but the results were baffling. There was no heartbeat, yet some internal systems seemed to be functioning in ways they couldn't understand. Dr. Mason, faced with the mystery, ordered additional tests, including a full scan of the infant. The scan only deepened the puzzle. Inside the child's body were structures that resembled human organs, but there were also other elements that defied explanation, patterns of tissue that no one could identify. "What are we dealing with here?" another doctor whispered, his voice thick with unease. The team was well trained in handling medical anomalies, but this was different. The infant was not simply sick or premature. It was something else entirely. There was a growing sense of dread in the room as they considered the possibilities, none of which made sense. For now, all they could do was keep the infant under observation and hope the tests would reveal more answers. Back in the maternity ward, Jane could no longer bear the uncertainty. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I need to know what's happening with our baby." Mark nodded, his own fear barely contained. He promised to find out and left Jane's side to speak with the doctors. As he walked down the sterile hospital hallway, his mind raced with every worst-case scenario imaginable. When he reached the observation room, he saw the concern etched on the faces of the medical staff. Dr. Mason pulled him aside, his face pale. "Mark, I'm afraid we're dealing with something we've never seen before," the doctor said in a low voice. Mark's heart sank as Dr. Mason explained the strange findings, but no one had any real answers yet. The only certainty was that this was no ordinary child. The following morning, Jane was awoken by a soft knock on the door. Dr. Mason entered, his face grave, and Mark followed closely behind, his eyes heavy with sleepless worry. Jane's heart pounded in her chest, her stomach twisting with anticipation of what they might say. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Mason began, "I want to be as transparent as possible with you. We've conducted a series of tests on your 10th baby, and we still don't fully understand what we are dealing with." Jane sat up, her hands trembling slightly as she braced herself for what came next. The doctor's expression was one of genuine confusion, as if he had never encountered anything like this in all his years of medical practice. "Your baby," Dr. Mason continued slowly, "has some unusual characteristics. It's not like the others, and we can't classify it as human, at least, not in the conventional sense." Jane's breath caught in her throat. Not human. The word seemed impossible, absurd even. How could that be? She had carried this child, felt its movements inside her body just like the others. It had been real, part of her. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though his own face was etched with fear. Dr. Mason took a deep breath before explaining further. "There are biological structures within your child that resemble organs, but their functionality doesn't match anything we've seen before. And there's more elements inside it that are not organic at all." The room seemed to close in around Jane as the implications of the doctor's words sank in. She had given birth to something that wasn't entirely human, something foreign and unknown. A mix of disbelief and horror filled her mind. "Is it alive?" she finally managed to ask. Dr. Mason hesitated before replying. "In a way, yes. It's functioning, but not in the way a normal infant would. We don't know how to explain it yet." The gravity of the situation pressed down on Jane and Mark, leaving them both speechless. How could something like this happen? There had been no warning, no sign that anything was wrong throughout her pregnancy. Yet here they were, faced with a mystery that defied all logic. As the conversation continued, the hospital staff worked tirelessly in the background, running more tests and analyzing the strange infant in the observation room. Behind the glass, the child lay motionless, its appearance more unsettling the longer they observed. The medical team had contacted specialists from around the world, hoping that someone, somewhere, could provide insight into this bizarre occurrence. Jane and Mark were left with a harrowing reality, one they could never have anticipated. The doctors had no answers, only more questions. The 10th baby, their baby, was something entirely different from what they had imagined. And as they struggled to comprehend the situation, an unsettling thought crept into their minds. What if this child wasn't from this world at all? Days passed, and the tension in the hospital grew thicker. Every specialist who reviewed the case was left just as baffled as the last. The infant remained in the observation room, its body showing no signs of deterioration or growth, but neither did it appear lifeless. Jane and Mark had been granted limited visitation, able to view their 10th child only through a thick glass wall. The other 9 babies, now thriving and growing stronger by the day, had been moved into the neonatal care unit, where Jane could hold and feed them. But each time she held one of her healthy children, her thoughts would drift back to the 10th. The strange, inexplicable baby that had captured the attention of the entire medical community. The hospital was now a hub of activity, with researchers, scientists, and even government officials quietly entering and leaving. It had become clear that this was no ordinary medical anomaly. One morning, a man who introduced himself as Dr. Gray, a leading biophysicist, approached Jane and Mark. His sharp, analytical eyes and calm demeanor contrasted with the uncertainty that plagued the other doctors. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, "we've made some progress in understanding what your 10th child is, though I must warn you, the findings are extraordinary." Jane's heart skipped a beat. This was what she had been waiting for, answers. Mark gripped her hand tightly as they braced themselves for what Dr. Gray was about to reveal. Dr. Gray pulled out several scans and images, spreading them across the table. "The biological structures within your child are indeed part organic, but they also contain materials that we've never encountered before. Not from this planet, at least." His words sent a chill through the room. "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Dr. Gray took a deep breath. "We believe that some of the components within your child's body are extraterrestrial in origin. They don't match any known substance on Earth, and their molecular structure is beyond anything we've seen in our studies of biology or physics." The silence that followed was deafening. Jane's mind reeled. Extraterrestrial? Her baby? As the reality of Dr. Gray's words sunk in, Jane felt a mixture of emotions: fear, confusion, and a strange sense of protectiveness over the child she had carried. "Are you saying that my baby is not human?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Gray hesitated before responding. "In some ways, yes. But it's not that simple. There are elements of human biology, but also components we don't fully understand yet. We're looking at something that may be part human, part something else." Jane couldn't breathe. The magnitude of what he was saying was almost too much to comprehend. How could she, an ordinary woman, have given birth to something so otherworldly? Mark, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. Dr. Gray met his gaze with a serious expression. "For now, we need to continue our research. We've contacted international organizations who specialize in phenomena like this, and they'll be arriving soon. But understand, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, this discovery goes beyond medical science. This could change everything we know about life itself." As Dr. Gray's words hung in the air, Jane and Mark realized that their lives, and the life of their 10th child, were about to change forever. What had started as the happiest moment of their lives had transformed into something far more complex and unimaginable. Their journey into the unknown was just beginning. The media caught wind of the extraordinary discovery within days, and soon, the hospital was swarmed by reporters from every corner of the world. Jane and Mark's quiet lives had been turned upside down, their story becoming a global sensation overnight. Headlines screamed with sensational claims: "Mother gives birth to alien-human hybrid," and "The Thompson baby, evidence of extraterrestrial life." The couple was overwhelmed by the sudden attention, and the hospital staff struggled to maintain a semblance of order as more and more people sought information about the mysterious 10th baby. The doctors tried to shield Jane and Mark from the chaos, but it was clear that their lives would never be the same. Inside the hospital, the situation grew more intense. Jane found herself under constant observation, not just from doctors, but from government officials who had now become deeply involved. They assured her and Mark that their family's safety was a priority, but the constant presence of security and officials made Jane feel like a prisoner in her own life. Every step she took was monitored. Every question she asked was met with careful, measured answers. She felt the walls closing in, and with each passing day, her desperation to understand what had happened to her 10th child grew. The only solace she found was in her visits with her 9 healthy babies. But even then, her thoughts were never far from the mystery she had unwittingly become a part of. Meanwhile, the 10th child remained under strict isolation. The medical and scientific teams were working around the clock, performing experiments and gathering data. The child still hadn't moved or cried like a normal infant, yet it wasn't deteriorating either. It simply existed in a strange, unexplainable state. Dr. Gray and his team had now expanded their research, bringing in experts from around the globe to help unravel the enigma. The consensus was that the child was a hybrid of some sort, though the origins of the extraterrestrial material remained unclear. "This is the most significant discovery of our time," one of the researchers had whispered to Dr. Gray. "It could redefine our understanding of biology and life itself." Jane, feeling helpless, demanded to see her 10th child. She couldn't stand the distance any longer, the mystery gnawing at her. After much negotiation and persuasion, the hospital granted her a supervised visit. The sterile observation room was cold and sterile as Jane entered, her heart pounding in her chest. There, in a glass enclosure, lay her 10th baby. It was small, pale, and motionless, but it was still her child. Tears welled in her eyes as she pressed her hand against the glass, longing to hold the baby she had carried for 9 months. "I don't care what it is," Jane whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "It's my baby, and I love it." In that moment, all the scientific questions, the headlines, and the chaos outside faded away. For Jane, this was her child, no matter where it had come from or what it might be. She would protect it with everything she had. But deep down, Jane knew that the mystery was far from over, and the answers she sought might lead to revelations she wasn't prepared to face. As Jane's connection with her 10th baby deepened, the world outside their hospital room spiraled further into chaos. Media outlets speculated wildly, and governments across the globe were now involved, with various agencies discreetly sending their representatives to the hospital. Jane and Mark were bombarded with requests for interviews, book deals, and even offers from documentary filmmakers who wanted to chronicle their story. It was overwhelming, but beneath the surface, something far more unsettling was unfolding. Hidden from the public, there were powerful forces at play, each with their own interests in the strange child Jane had given birth to. One evening, as Jane rested in her room after another emotional visit to the observation area, Mark was approached by a man in a dark suit. He introduced himself as Agent Cole from an undisclosed government agency, his presence sharp and commanding. "Mr. Thompson, I'm here to talk about the 10th child," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. Mark, already wary of the increased governmental presence, stiffened. "What do you want with our baby?" Mark asked, his voice edged with distrust. Agent Cole paused before responding. "What we're dealing with is beyond what anyone could have imagined. It's not just about your family anymore. This child could hold the key to understanding life beyond our world. We need to ensure its safety and study it further." Mark's stomach turned as the meaning behind Cole's words sunk in. They didn't see the child as his son or daughter. To them, it was an object of study, a specimen. As the days went by, it became clear that the government had their own plans for the 10th baby. Jane and Mark, though given a front-row seat to the medical developments, were slowly being pushed to the periphery of the situation. Meetings were held without them, key decisions about their child's future being made behind closed doors. Jane's frustrations grew, her maternal instincts screaming at her that something was terribly wrong. "They're treating our baby like an experiment," she confided in Mark one evening. "I don't trust them. We need to do something." But what could they do? The power these agencies held was beyond anything they had ever encountered. Behind the scenes, Dr. Gray, who had once been Jane and Mark's strongest advocate, was also facing pressure. His team was being pulled in different directions by competing interests, governments, corporations, and even private institutions eager to be part of the groundbreaking research. The stakes were getting higher by the day. However, something about the way Jane spoke to her child, the way she cared despite the unknown, started to affect Dr. Gray. He had always approached his work with cold logic, but now, seeing Jane's struggle and unwavering love for her baby, something shifted within him. He began to question the morality of what they were doing. Was it truly about science, or had this become something darker, more about control than discovery? One night, unable to sleep, Dr. Gray sat alone in his office, poring over the latest data. The more he studied, the more he realized how little they truly understood. The baby wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It was something far greater. A delicate balance of human and alien. Something that could either unite or divide humanity. His thoughts drifted to Jane's last words to her child during her visit. "I don't care what you are. You're mine." He realized then that he had a choice to make. Would he stand by and let the government take full control, or would he find a way to protect the family, especially this innocent child who had done nothing but exist? The answers were unclear, but Dr. Gray knew that, moving forward, his decisions could change everything. The growing tension between the Thompsons and the authorities had reached its breaking point. Jane could no longer sit idly by as the government agencies tightened their grip on her 10th child. Every day, more tests, more meetings, and more people crowded the hospital, each one further from the emotional reality Jane was living. She could feel the weight of their intentions pressing down on her, and she knew one thing for certain: they would take her child if she didn't act soon. She confided in Mark, her voice trembling with fear and determination. "They're not going to stop until they take our baby away from us, Mark. We can't let that happen. We have to do something." Mark, who had been trying to keep calm for both of their sakes, realized that Jane was right. The visits to the observation room had become more controlled, their movements monitored, and the tone of the officials had grown more distant and clinical. They weren't just being treated as parents. They were becoming witnesses to something much larger. "What are you suggesting?" Mark asked, knowing full well what Jane's answer would be. She looked him in the eyes, her face pale but determined. "We need to get our baby out of here. I don't care how dangerous it is. We can't let them turn our child into a lab rat." Together, they devised a desperate plan. With the help of a sympathetic nurse who had grown close to Jane during her time in the hospital, they began to gather information about the security protocols surrounding the observation room. The nurse, a kind woman named Susan, had noticed the growing unease in Jane's eyes and had shared her own discomfort with the way the authorities were handling the case. "They're not telling you everything," Susan whispered one evening. "There are things happening here that you don't want to know about. But I'll help you. You deserve the chance to protect your family." With Susan's inside knowledge, they began to map out a way to sneak into the observation room, retrieve the baby, and escape the hospital before anyone could stop them. The night of the plan arrived. It was a quiet evening, the hospital less busy than usual, which worked in their favor. Jane and Mark moved cautiously through the hallways, their hearts pounding in their chests. Susan had arranged for a brief power outage in the observation room, just long enough for them to slip in and out without triggering the alarms. They made their way to the isolated area where their 10th baby was being kept. As they reached the door, Jane felt her breath catch. She had waited so long for this moment, to finally hold her child, despite all the fear and confusion that had surrounded its existence. Mark gently squeezed her hand, and together, they entered the dimly lit room. There, in the incubator, lay their 10th child. The pale, strange features still unnerved Jane, but her love for the child was unwavering. She carefully picked up the baby, cradling it in her arms for the first time. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered softly, "You're coming home with us, my love. I don't care what the world thinks you are. You're ours." Mark stood by her side, his resolve hardening. But as they turned to leave, an unexpected sound filled the room, the hum of the power returning, much earlier than planned. The lights flickered on, and the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Gray, his face a mix of shock and understanding. Jane's heart stopped. Had he come to stop them? For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was palpable. But then Dr. Gray stepped forward, his expression softening. "Go," he said quietly. "Take your baby and go. I'll buy you some time." Jane and Mark exchanged a look of disbelief and gratitude. Dr. Gray had made his decision, one that would change the course of all their lives. With his help, they rushed out of the hospital, escaping into the night with their child, unsure of what would come next, but knowing they had made the only choice they could. The journey ahead would be fraught with danger, but for now they were free to love their child without the prying eyes of the world. The cold night air hit Jane's face as she and Mark stepped out of the hospital, their hearts pounding from the adrenaline. Their child was bundled tightly in Jane's arms, fragile yet precious, as they moved quickly through the dimly lit streets. There was no time to waste. They had minutes, maybe less, before someone inside the hospital realized what had happened. Dr. Gray had bought them time, but they knew the government wouldn't let them go easily. Every step they took felt like a race against an unseen clock, each sound heightening their fear of being caught. Mark led the way, his mind racing to figure out where they could go, where they could hide. They had planned this, but now that they were free, it felt as though they were flying blind. Their car, parked a few blocks away, was their only lifeline. Mark had carefully chosen a vehicle without any connection to their names, purchased through a friend who owed him a favor. As they reached the car, Jane carefully settled into the back seat with the baby, her heart finally calming for just a moment. Mark jumped into the driver's seat, starting the engine as quietly as possible. "We need to head for the safe house," he said, glancing at Jane through the rearview mirror. She nodded, her arms still wrapped protectively around the baby. It felt surreal, driving away from the life they had known, their world upended by the very existence of their 10th child. They had no idea what awaited them, but Jane knew one thing for certain. She would protect her baby at all costs. Hours passed as they drove through the night, avoiding major roads and checkpoints. Mark had connections from his past, people who could help them lie low for a while. But they couldn't stop for long. The authorities were undoubtedly already on their trail, and every minute spent in one place increased the risk of being found. The safe house, a small cabin hidden in a remote area, was their first stop. It wasn't much, but it offered the privacy and security they desperately needed. As they pulled up to the cabin, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. Exhausted but determined, they carried their child inside, locking the doors behind them. Inside the cabin, Jane finally had a moment to breathe. She gently laid the baby down on a makeshift bed they had prepared, staring down at the tiny being that had changed everything. It looked peaceful, innocent, yet its very existence had drawn the attention of forces far beyond anything Jane or Mark had ever imagined. "What are we going to do now?" Jane whispered, her voice filled with both love and fear. Mark sat beside her, rubbing his tired eyes. "We'll figure it out," he replied, though even he wasn't sure what that meant. The reality was they were now fugitives, running from a government that wanted their child not as a person, but as a scientific specimen. Mark knew that if they were caught, they'd never see their baby again. As the first light of day filtered through the cabin windows, Jane and Mark tried to gather their thoughts. But they weren't the only ones thinking about what would come next. Back at the hospital, Dr. Gray was being questioned. The government officials had already realized what had happened, and the search for the Thompsons had begun in earnest. Despite the pressure, Dr. Gray remained calm, giving the authorities as little information as possible while he formulated his own plan. He had taken a risk helping Jane and Mark escape, but deep down, he knew he had done the right thing. What he didn't know was how far the government would go to retrieve the child, and that they were willing to go to any lengths to get it back. For Jane and Mark, the race for their child's future had just begun. The peace Jane and Mark found in the secluded cabin was short-lived. Barely a day had passed when they noticed unusual activity outside. A helicopter buzzed over the distant treetops, its sound faint but growing louder with each pass. They knew this was no coincidence. The government was searching for them, and it was only a matter of time before their safe house was discovered. Mark, always the planner, had anticipated this. He had packed emergency supplies, maps, and burner phones. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice steady but urgent. Jane, cradling their baby, nodded silently. The fear in her eyes mirrored his, but she steeled herself. There was no time for panic, only action. Mark had prepared a second vehicle hidden in a nearby clearing, an off-road truck that would be harder to trace. They packed up quickly, moving with the quiet efficiency of people whose lives were on the line. The baby, still eerily silent and motionless, was wrapped in blankets and gently placed in Jane's arms. Though its existence was at the heart of their escape, it remained a strange, almost ghostly presence. Jane's maternal instincts never wavered, but she couldn't shake the growing unease about the nature of her child. What exactly was she protecting? As they sped down the dirt roads, heading deeper into the wilderness, she couldn't help but wonder, if they were running from more than just the government. The road ahead was treacherous, full of sharp turns and steep inclines that made the journey perilous. Mark drove with focused determination, navigating the harsh terrain with skill, but Jane could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Every mile they traveled, the thought lingered. How long could they keep this up? The world beyond the trees felt like it was closing in on them, a giant machine designed to track, capture, and control. "We can't outrun them forever," Jane whispered, her voice cracking under the pressure. Mark glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his face set with resolve. "We don't need to outrun them forever," he replied. "Just long enough to find a way to disappear completely." Their destination was an old cabin deep in the mountains, a place Mark had secured through a friend who owed him a favor. It was off-grid, accessible only by foot after a certain point, and far from prying eyes. But as they drove deeper into the wilderness, Jane's unease grew. The baby, though physically healthy, remained so still, almost unnaturally so. She had expected it to grow, change, or at least exhibit some sign of development. But the child was as mysterious now as it had been the day it was born. Jane couldn't help but feel that whatever made her child different, it wasn't just biological. There was something else, something she didn't understand. Night fell as they reached the edge of a dense forest where the road ended. "We walk from here," Mark said quietly. They gathered their supplies and, with the baby securely in Jane's arms, began the trek through the dark woods. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set their nerves on edge. But the real danger wasn't the wilderness. It was the agents who would be closing in soon, scouring every inch of the land for the family. As they pressed on, Jane's thoughts were consumed by her child. Was it human? Was it something else entirely? And more importantly, could she trust the growing fear in her heart? Or was it just the pressure of their situation playing tricks on her mind? Only time, and the truth that would soon be revealed, could tell. As Jane and Mark trudged deeper into the forest, the trees thickened, their gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal arms, blocking the moonlight. The path was rugged, barely visible beneath the undergrowth, but they pushed forward, guided by the small flashlight Mark carried. The weight of the baby in Jane's arms felt heavier with each step, though the child remained as still and silent as ever. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, his senses on high alert. He knew they were being hunted. The government would stop at nothing to find them, and the cover of night was only temporary. They needed to reach the cabin before daybreak. After what felt like hours, they finally reached a small clearing. The cabin stood at the center, old and weathered, barely more than a shadow in the moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was their only refuge for the time being. Mark quickly unlocked the door, and they slipped inside, locking it behind them. The interior was as rustic as they expected, dusty with old furniture and no electricity, but it was hidden, and that was all that mattered. Jane laid the baby down on a makeshift bed, her heart racing as she looked at the child's motionless form. For a moment, she just stood there, staring, as if waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the baby remained unervingly still. Mark busied himself checking the windows, making sure they hadn't been followed, while Jane sat beside their child. Her thoughts raced, circling the same question over and over. What is this child? The love she felt was undeniable, but so was the fear. As if sensing her turmoil, the baby's eyes, closed for so long, suddenly flickered open. Jane gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The baby's eyes weren't like a normal newborn's. They were dark, deep, almost alien in their intensity. The stare wasn't one of innocence, but of something older, more knowing. Jane's breath hitched as she met the baby's gaze, and for the first time, she truly felt the weight of what they had been running from. This child wasn't just different. It was something else. Before Jane could react, the door to the cabin swung open with a loud crash. Mark turned just in time to see a figure step inside, a shadowy silhouette against the night sky. It was Dr. Gray. His face was grim, and there was no mistaking the urgency in his eyes. "They're coming," he whispered, stepping quickly inside and closing the door behind him. Mark stood frozen for a moment, confusion and anger flashing across his face. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, stepping forward to confront the doctor. But Dr. Gray raised his hands, a silent plea for calm. "I'm not here to take your child. I'm here to help. You need to trust me." Jane's heart raced, her mind spinning. Could they trust him? After all, it had been Dr. Gray who had helped them escape the hospital, risking his career and safety to give them a chance at freedom. But now, as he stood before them, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he had let on. "Why are you really here?" Jane asked, her voice trembling as she held the baby close. Dr. Gray hesitated, his gaze shifting to the child. "There's more to this than I told you at the hospital," he admitted, his voice low and serious. "This baby, it's not just an anomaly. It's part of something far bigger than any of us." The room fell into a heavy silence as his words hung in the air. "What are you talking about?" Mark asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Dr. Gray sighed, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving the baby. "This child isn't just a hybrid of human and something else. It's a signal, a message, and if we don't protect it, the ones who sent it will come looking." Jane's blood ran cold. A message? Sent by who? And what did that mean for their child, and for them? As if sensing the danger, the baby blinked slowly, its dark eyes glistening with a strange, unearthly light. The revelation left Jane and Mark reeling, but they had no time to process it. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps could be heard approaching the cabin. The chase had caught up to them, and now, the real danger was only beginning. Dr. Gray turned to the door, his voice barely a whisper. "They've found us." The sound of footsteps grew louder, crunching over the fallen leaves outside the cabin. Jane's heart raced, her breath shallow as she clutched the baby tightly to her chest. Mark positioned himself by the window, peeking through the cracks in the weathered wood. "There are too many of them," he whispered, his voice low and filled with dread. Jane could see the panic in his eyes, but they had no choice now but to trust Dr. Gray. The cabin, isolated and hidden, had provided temporary refuge, but the agents had found them. Dr. Gray moved quickly, his mind racing. "We have a small window of time," he said quietly, turning to face Jane and Mark. "If they get in here and take the child, everything changes. You'll lose it forever. But there's a way out. I've been studying this baby, and I think I understand how to protect it." His words were cryptic, but there was no time for explanations. Jane could see that even Dr. Gray didn't fully understand the gravity of what he was saying. There was a look of desperation in his eyes, the weight of the unknown pressing down on all of them. "What are you talking about?" Mark demanded, his voice tight. "How do we protect our child?" Before Dr. Gray could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. Jane flinched, holding the baby closer as her heart pounded in her chest. "You need to trust me," Dr. Gray said quickly, his voice urgent. "There's a signal embedded in the child's DNA, something the others, whoever they are, will detect. But I think I've found a way to block it temporarily, long enough to get you out of here." He reached into his bag, pulling out a small device, a metallic object that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. "This can cloak the signal," he explained, "but only for a short time. You'll need to get far away from here, and fast." The door rattled violently as the agents outside tried to force their way in. Jane's hands trembled, torn between fear for her child and the desperate hope that Dr. Gray's plan might actually work. "We don't have a choice," she whispered to Mark, her voice barely audible over the pounding on the door. Mark nodded grimly, his face set in determination. "Do it," he said to Dr. Gray. "Whatever it takes." Dr. Gray moved quickly, attaching the device to the baby's blanket and adjusting it with a few quick taps. As soon as it activated, the baby's eyes flickered again, that strange, unearthly light dimming as the signal was cloaked. "It's working," Dr. Gray said, his relief palpable. "But we have to move now." Just as he finished speaking, the door burst open. Armed agents flooded into the cabin, their weapons drawn and eyes searching for the child. "Get down!" one of them shouted, but Mark and Jane didn't hesitate. Mark grabbed Jane's arm, pulling her toward the back exit that Dr. Gray had discreetly pointed out earlier. They dashed through the narrow hallway as the agents stormed the cabin, their movements swift and calculated. Dr. Gray stayed behind, blocking the agents momentarily as they scrambled to understand what had just happened. The back door led to a dense thicket of trees. Jane clutched the baby to her chest as they stumbled into the forest, branches scratching their faces and legs as they ran. Mark kept a firm grip on her hand, leading the way through the underbrush. The night was dark, but the adrenaline surging through their veins kept them moving. They could hear shouts in the distance as the agents realized the family had escaped. The forest was vast, but the agents were close behind. "Keep moving," Mark urged, his breath ragged. Jane's legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed forward, refusing to stop. The baby was silent, but the eerie calm in its eyes haunted her with every step. What was this child truly capable of? What did the agents, and these mysterious others, want with it? As they ran deeper into the forest, the sounds of the chase began to fade, but they knew they weren't safe yet. Jane glanced down at the baby in her arms. "We'll keep you safe," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. The truth was, their lives had been turned upside down, and they were running from a force they didn't fully understand. But they had no choice. They would keep running, for their child, for their family, and for the answers that still eluded them. For now they had escaped, but Jane knew the chase was far from over. The real danger was yet to come. The forest thickened around them, each step harder than the last as Jane and Mark pushed forward, branches whipping at their faces and the underbrush growing denser. The baby in Jane's arms remained eerily calm, its dark eyes observing the world with an intensity that still sent chills down her spine. Mark led the way, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes to check if they were being followed. The agents' voices had faded into the distance, but the fear of being caught still loomed heavily over them. The device Dr. Gray had attached to the baby had bought them time, but how long could it really protect them? Hours passed as they moved deeper into the wilderness, and the exhaustion began to take its toll. Mark stopped abruptly in a small clearing, bending over to catch his breath. Jane, too, felt her legs trembling with fatigue, but she refused to let go of the baby. "We can't stop now," she whispered, her voice filled with determination despite the fear gnawing at her. Mark nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I know," he said, "but we need to figure out our next move. We can't just keep running without a plan." They sat down briefly, trying to gather their thoughts. The cold night air chilled them, and the silence of the forest pressed in, making every sound feel amplified. Jane cradled the baby, feeling a strange connection to it despite everything. She couldn't help but wonder about what Dr. Gray had said, that their child wasn't just human, but something more, something that had drawn the attention of forces far beyond their understanding. "Mark," Jane said softly, "what if this baby is something we can't protect? What if it's bigger than us?" The weight of her words hung in the air, and Mark remained silent for a moment, considering the gravity of the situation. "We'll protect it no matter what," Mark finally said, though his voice lacked the confidence it once had. "But we need to find help, someone we can trust." Jane knew he was right, but the question was, who could they turn to? Everyone seemed to have their own agenda when it came to the baby, and now even Dr. Gray, the one person they thought they could trust, had revealed the child's true nature, something far beyond human. The weight of that realization crushed down on them both. But Jane's resolve was unwavering. "We need to keep moving," she said firmly. "We can't stop until we're sure we're safe." They continued on, moving through the night as the first hints of dawn began to break on the horizon. The landscape changed, the trees thinning as they reached the foothills of a mountain range. Jane's legs ached and Mark's pace slowed, but they pressed on. Just as they thought they couldn't go any farther, they came upon an old, abandoned structure hidden within the trees. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, covered in moss and vines, but it offered a place to rest, a brief respite from the relentless chase. They approached cautiously, checking for any signs of danger before entering. The inside was as old and worn as the outside, but it provided shelter, and for the moment that was enough. Mark secured the door, while Jane settled down with the baby. The air inside the cabin was stale, and the only light came from the soft glow of dawn creeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. As Jane looked down at the baby, she noticed something different. Its eyes, once filled with an unsettling stillness, now seemed more alert, more aware. There was an intelligence there, something she couldn't quite grasp but felt deep in her gut. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, and Jane's heart raced. She looked around frantically, thinking the agents had found them again. But the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the baby. Mark rushed over, his eyes wide with shock as the hum grew louder, filling the small cabin with an almost magnetic energy. The baby's eyes glowed faintly, and Jane's grip tightened around it, fear flooding her senses. "Mark, what's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before Mark could respond, the baby moved for the first time since its birth. Its small hand reached out, touching Jane's arm gently. The hum stopped, and a strange calm fell over the room. The baby's touch sent a wave of warmth through Jane's body, and in that moment she understood. This child, whatever it was, wasn't just a signal or a message. It was a bridge between worlds, a being that held the key to something far greater than either of them could have imagined. "We have to protect it," Jane whispered, her fear slowly giving way to a deep, unshakable resolve. "No matter what it takes." Mark nodded, the weight of their responsibility settling heavily on them both. They had escaped for now, but the real battle was only beginning. What lay ahead was uncertain, but Jane knew one thing for sure. Their child wasn't just theirs anymore, it was the future. And with that future came the greatest danger they had ever faced. If you like this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, you have a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and heartwarming moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.